uneven division of labor on a global scale, and all of what that entails. Okay? So the spatial structures that capitalism has already developed. So in this case, what we see is the messages of brotherhood and sisterhood clash with messages of self-preservation. And we're seeing that at any cost. So we're seeing this tension right now rear its head in various contexts around the world. So this speaks to the core tension at root in what we're trying to do here, which is that we are actually, under capitalist social relations, we are competing for jobs and investment, right? So we are in this, we do have this problem. And so within this context where capital is able to create and then deepen these existing inequalities that have arisen through these historical processes, what do we do about this competition? So the sense of competition only becomes amplified when we consider building solidarities across regions or sectors or national borders where there isn't necessarily a common employer or even a common language. So we know all this. So what do we do here? So for some, this uneven development and all these structural limitations means that we really have to dismiss transnationalism altogether as a utopian dream. Okay? And so, and we all know this both in academic circles and in the trade union movement, right? The sense in which internationalism is seen as peripheral, and just outright dismissed. So while there's no shortage of challenges to building transnational solidarity, the danger is that this ends up reinforcing an idea that of a national logic for the terrain in which we organize. And beyond this, this approach dismisses outright and contributes internationalism outright, and contributes nothing to helping us make sense of the various innovative practices that have arisen, particularly in the new context of the realities of global production. So mirroring the debates on the potential of trade unions themselves, the responses to these pessimistic approaches tend towards the exaggerated optimism. So we have both of these. So one of the dangers of this approach is the tendency to avoid critical reflection. And there is much that remains in this sphere to be critical of, from new forms of labor imperialism to efforts to globalize business unionism. Not all of these international efforts are great if we're exporting models that are really problematic and completely disconnected from workers. So this excessive optimism often operates inside both labor organizations and within academic research through a disconnection, I argue, from theory and from history. So, for instance, when there is an acknowledgement or discussion of labor internationalism pre-1990, there is a tendency to write off the practices that happened during the Cold War as no longer of import. Okay? So what I argue is that neither of these approaches are useful. Okay? Instead of a framework of optimism and pessimism, I think we really need to move away from this. We need to develop a more nuanced and historically grounded analytical framework for labor internationalism today. And to do this, we need to go back to that history. We need to look at the real structural limitations, but also the historical failures and how that informs our organizing today. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Canadian case. How long do I have, Cynthia? I'm going to have to skip mine.
Maybe 7 minutes.
Okay. So I argue that the institutional form of Canadian labor internationalism that developed in the 40s and 50s was characterized both by labor imperialism and by accommodationist solidarity. So that is a form of activity that's understood as solidarity but reinforces global inequalities. So I argue that neither arguments based on the labor aristocracy thesis, the idea that workers in the North should necessarily be written off because they necessarily benefit from and end up supporting imperialism, nor arguments that reduce this program to the sometimes very fervent anti-communism of specific leaders in the international program. There's no shortage of them, okay? But that's not the whole story. Okay? So in the case of the labor aristocracy thesis, I think that Charlie Post's work is useful here. Post argues that the benefits of the working class of the industrialized countries from imperialist investments are neither automatic nor evenly distributed. These are based on class struggle. Okay? So this has become very clear since the 70s, where we've seen massive expansion and unimaginable profits that have not coincided with much benefit to those workers in the North. And so the sense of mutuality that exists between workers in the North and their employers and the state, okay, this is something that's cultivated. This is something that's ideological. This is something that's about consciousness. And this is what we need to unpack. What is at play in this? And I argue that ideas of race and nation are a critical feature of this. All right, so based on my research, I argue that the dominant form of labor internationalism in Canada was shaped beyond the Cold War ideological allegiances, was shaped by a philosophy of social partnership with the state and capital, steeped in particular ideas about race, nation, and class that came out of Canadian context, Canadian class formation. So in part, for those of you who do know Canadian labor history very well, part of this has to do with laborism, the history of laborism, the kind of liberal white identity that created a sense of a white working, transnational white working class identity across the British Commonwealth. And you can read my work to look at that more. So using the cases of Kenya, the Colombo Plan, the Caribbean and Palestine, my work explores how the Canadian the Canadian Congress of Labour and then the Canadian Labour Congress developed a program that was specifically social democratic form of anti-communism that by the late 50s had characteristics that were really close to that of European trade union federations than that of the AFL-CIO, but one that bore specific features of Canadian class formation. So continuing the work of the International Department of the CCL and the CLC International Department and Committee, they reflected the ideological battles between liberals and social democrats and revolutionary socialists over ideas of workers' justice, strategy, the nature of worker struggles. And so this program was developed simultaneously with and bears the markings of the major ideological purges in the 40s. But what emerged from this international program was a coordinated anti-communist labor strategy under the auspices of the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions and its regional organizations. And like it, the ICFTU, the CCL, and the CLC supported NATO, Bretton Woods, Marshall Plan, this program was generally aligned with Canadian foreign policy, stood clearly against anti-colonial struggles, engaged in practices such as building up trade union structures to compete with existing unions tied to anti-colonial struggles, as in the case of Kenya. There was a steel worker there working on that in the 50s, and supported more general efforts aimed at undermining liberation struggles and supporting imperialist ventures of the US in Asia. So what is important to note is that the orientation of the early Cold War institutional labor internationalism was not just guided by anti-communism, but by a sense in which these actions were really seen as in the interest of Canadian workers. The sense of mutuality of interest between workers, the state and capital internationally, is evident not only in the active cooperation the CLC and the CCL sought with the state and capital through various efforts to collaborate on foreign policy and even more closely through the establishment of the development aid structure, but also through the different ways that Southern workers were understood, not as allies, but as both potential opportunities for and threats to the prosperity of workers. So after, in the North, after the initial focus on the threat of revolution in France and Italy by the core ICFTU affiliates, concern shifted to rising anti-colonial struggles. So many of which were clearly Marxist-leaning in their analysis of the nature of capitalism and of global class formation, which I think is critical here. The orientation of these struggles, much like, the orientation to these struggles, much like that of the CIO in the US and many social democratic federations, was based on an idea of belly communism. So belly communism is an idea that extreme forms of poverty would be a gateway for revolution, and that would mean nationalization of industries, potentially, barring of access to resources. Okay? So it went beyond the ideological. These were seen as being in the interest, the expansion of Canadian and American capital internationally were seen as in the interest of Canadian workers. And so beyond the ideological anti-communism of these practices, there was a sense in which this was pragmatic and having access and trying to support access to resources, while also reducing the threat of low-wage worker competition. So to do this, there needed to be joint international action on the part of labor, capital, and the state, and this is what was developed in the late 40s and the early 50s. Primarily facilitated through various development aid initiatives that became more formalized as years went on. These operated to fund unions that were not tied to or sometimes in opposition to anti-colonial struggles, as I mentioned. And the vision of belly communism was not only tied to a specific vision of social partnership that grew out of social democracy, it was also clearly a response to the direct confrontation with racialized global divisions of labor posed by anti-colonial struggles. As historian Gerald Horne notes, the anti-colonial upsurge was designed to overturn the racialized system of oppression and underdevelopment that colonialism represented. Okay, I had a case study, I don't know how to talk about it, on the Caribbean and what they did there, supporting Alcan and Naranda. But just to say that I think if we are going to build, and I think Dave talked about it, kind of stuff the CPW is doing, I think we really do need to address ideas of white supremacy within our unions if we are going to build a sense in which overcome this this identity and mutuality with employers and really see ourselves as part of a kind of international